Hello, my day is Monday, I believe it's the 6th of April, and it's a day that the new album comes out, which is basically, now that's what I call music, 72. Now, the Americans are only on something like 30, now 30 at least, so they're a long way off from what we are basically in the series. Now, I'd like to talk about this because it's a strong subject for a lot of people, to talk about, that every year or every time one of these compilations come out, basically people say that they are the greatest compilation in the world when it comes to music. Well, especially in Great Britain, because they say that it features what is commonly the hits of the time. People buy it because it's got all the hits on one disc. You don't have to worry about buying another disc. Well, understandably, today it probably does, but there is a slight angle or problem that people might not notice when they often talk about. They say that if you own every single Now album, you can almost have the whole hits collection dating right back to 1983, when the very first Now album actually came out. And basically, it was a good project. They thought of this idea. EMI and Virgin basically got together and decided that we could create a compilation for the latest hit records. Before that, there wasn't much. There was pretty much things like K-Tel and so on doing these like chartbusters type albums where it was one album. It had something like roughly about 8 records on one side and 8 on another, which is about 16 tracks. And it would have been, you buy the first one, you get the second one free. These are like from 1981, 82, that kind of thing. They were pretty much some of the hits of the time, and they did feature some pretty interesting stuff because some of them weren't actually really big hit records like that. And when the Now album came out, they decided that they wanted to do something that featured the hits. But we would like to pose a question about something else that came out a year after. The Hits album, which we have here, the very first ever Hits album on vinyl record. Now this was actually in conjunction with um, doing their own, and a lot of people probably said they were trying to be like the Now albums, they were trying to compete against them. And it could be said that you could compose the question about which compilation was the best, a Now album or the Hits album. The Hits album actually stopped around the mid noughties, about 2005, I believe. They stopped making them, which is a bit of a sad thing. But then again, of course, the Now album started to, um, but the Now album came on the tradition of what the Hits album had left off, because basically, I don't think that the Now albums have always been the greatest compilation in the world. I mean, they certainly do have a lot of hits, but when you go down the years, you often find many artists never featured on a Now album, and I believe it's because it's contractual rights. The Now album only ever consisted mostly of Universal, EMI, Virgin signed artists. There was probably the very few that were signed to companies like Sony and BMG at the time. They now merged, but at the time. So people would often say, all these bands that were on Sony and BMG, they're not on the Now albums. Now there was a few that got on there for some reason. I don't know why, whether it was because they were allowed or not, but that's what made both compilations tick at the time, because it was not really in conjunction with being competed. The Hits album had their record companies, the Now albums had theirs, i.e. the Now albums would often than not feature EMI, Virgin, Universal signed acts. I think it was don't know whether it was Warner Music or something like that, basically. So if you had a record on that company, you more likely would feature on a Now album. The Hit album would come along and say there's Sony artists, there's obviously the BMG artists. I think it was Warner as well, I'm not sure, or WA, companies like that, who basically would be featured on a Hits album. That's why I've said that it's quite a thing to denote that, why people think that the Now albums have always been the best, and they don't buy Hits albums. Sometimes they don't buy them to think, but the contrast was not the Now album featured everyone. And taking the example of the Hits album, when it first came out, you had things on there like Wham, Freedom. Now they did feature on a Now album back in the day. Wake Me Up Before You Go was a particular song, but you never got much of the Wham stuff. So to have one song and that, you're thinking, well, what about the rest? You go down the list, and things like Michael Jackson only ever appeared on a Now album once, technically, and that was Farewell My Summer Love on Now number 4. So to think about that, you're thinking, so there's your thing. Why did he not appear on that? And he was signed to Sony Music, so therefore he wasn't really a part of the older Now album collection. And he got onto the first hit album with Thriller. You go down the list and you find all kinds of artists, like for instance Rod Stewart, Some Guys Have All the Look. He was only ever on the first Now album, I believe, and that was for Baby Jane, but I don't think he really sacrificed and appeared any more than that. Other bands like the Jackson Body on this one, again, they never really featured on an Now album. You often get that, where a Now album didn't feature so many artists, and like Prince, one of the biggest artists in the whole world of music, and I don't believe he was on a Hits album. No, I mean a Now album whatsoever. But the Hits album welcome him with open arms, starting with obviously Purple Rain on that one. In fact, and you go down the list, you go down the years, and you find people like Deacon Blue, one of the big Scottish rock bands, never appeared on an album, but got their music on a Hits album at the time. In fact, another one that I'm surprised with is basically Aha, because they were one of the biggest bands of the 80s. Now, you think, they were on an Now album. Surely it would be the hits. Not technically the biggest hits. Hunting High and Low, and Manhattan Skyline, and then about roughly a good 15, 20 odd years later, well, whatever amount of years later, what do? They're again, but analog. I think it was Cozy Prisons on there as well, but roughly around 3 songs. So there's an interesting thing. They were never on the Now album for their biggest hits. However, when you buy the Hits albums, you're going to get Take On Me, you're going to get The Sun Always Shines on TV, The Living Daylights, You Are The One, and basically any of the, and Star on These Roads. Some of their pretty much bigger hits actually appeared on a Hits album. And the one that surprises a lot of people, and I'm sure maybe so, is Shakin' Stevens, the biggest selling singles artist of the 80s, yet never appeared on an Now album apart from the very first Christmas album of the 80s with a song called Blue Christmas. But when it comes to the actual compilations, because they often thought, oh, he's signed to Sony, we're not going to really include him, are we? So the Hits album picked it up by stating, well, he's having top 20 hits at the time, so we're going to have the first one, which will be Teardrops, followed by, if you've got hits number 2, again, it'll be on there with Breaking Up My Heart. Hits number 3 comes along, Lipstick, Powder and Paint. It goes on to hits number 4, which he was not on. Hits number 5, Because I Love You. Hits number 6, he wasn't on. And then his last feature was hits number 7, What Do You Want to Make Those Eyes at Me For? And it just shows exactly how different it is to find certain artists who were on there. Sometimes an artist was on the Hits and the Now album, but for different reasons, for different songs, like that. And I do believe that is said for something like Howard Jones. He wasn't on all of the Now albums. He got on 1 or 2 of the Now albums for 1 or 2 songs, but then again, they failed to incorporate the fact that, oh, we're not including him for all the hits. So what happens is the Hits album comes along, and bingo. This is exactly what we can do. Let's put Howard Jones on there, and we've got a song here. Look, things can only get better by Howard Jones as an example. And Paul Young, he was another one that failed to incorporate all of his songs on there, because I believe Whenever I Lay My Hat, That's My Home was on the first ever Now album. But he hasn't had much else, so therefore I'm going to tell you Playhouse Down and songs like Everything Must Change, not on there. Some of the really classic records of the time, like Foreigner, I Want to Know What Love Is, failed to feature on a Now album, but did get onto hits number 2. So there is a contrast to people saying that the Now albums have been the best compilation in the world, but they're not exactly the best when it comes to featuring artists from all sides of the record labels. And now that the Hits album don't go, they do have that thing about putting on lots of things. And in fact, modern stars like Westlife didn't really feature on the Now albums when they first started, so all their hits were pretty much demised of the inclusion. Uptown Girl was the first one actually, and then it all went until they had that thing where hits albums don't go, so the Now album started to build up a little bit more with the thing. So there you go. That's a little bit of talk about what you think, and I'm sure that people might want to argument on this about what is better, the Now albums or the hit albums. And I'll see you later, so goodbye.